for the West County School Board and your qualifications for being a school board trustee.
Since 2004, I've been an educational researcher and a reform specialist for California Department of Education. Also been a resident of Richmond, have worked with school reform in districts and schools all over the state of California, but never worked in Richmond in a systemic way. 4 children in the district, 1 grandson, and been very frustrated by the fact that in this district, we continually treat the symptom of the achievement gap. We treat the symptom of underperformance, and we never get to the core issue. And as with any problem, if you treat the symptom without dealing with the core issue, you make the problem worse over time. And eventually, of course, we blame the patient for the patient getting worse in that scenario. So it's been a lifelong passion of mine to work in education. I've witnessed this district, in my opinion, fail repeatedly. And my desire is to bring about some systemic change within the district.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon.
Good evening.
I can take my glasses off to see the questions.
Oh, okay.
And put them on to reach you.
Oh, okay, that's fine. That's fine.
All right. You stated one of your top priorities is student achievement.
Yes.
Okay. How would you leverage your knowledge and experience in your specific role as a board member to drive improved student achievement? That's one question. And the next one, how do you think about the school board's role here versus the superintendent and the district staff?
Okay. So I'm challenged by my maleness. So it's hard for me to juggle 2 things, so I'll take the first one. In terms of student achievement, I don't know that there, other than student safety, and student achievement and safety are intertwined in my opinion, but I don't know that there is another priority. And wrapped in all of that, between achievement and safety is also fiscal responsibility. And so it's important that we develop a coherent and viable assessment of where we are so that we can get to the core issues around student achievement and support what happens in the classroom first and move from classroom support for teachers and students and move out. And so as a school board, I think it's, in my specific role would be to continually push for the use of research-based practices. And I'm excited by the fact that we have a new person as gonna be leading the curriculum and instruction, because I don't know her, but I know she's from Houston. And if you look up the Houston district and what they've done, it's absolutely amazing. It's replicated all over the country through the practices that I would insist upon in our district. And so it's not isolated to Houston, but it's somehow avoided being used in Richmond. And so the second part was the role of the school board versus the staff. Well, superintendent and staff. Well, I see the role of the board to manage the superintendent. That we need to manage one person, and we have to insist on a collective effort that is entirely focused on what happens in the classroom. The value of involving all stakeholders in a collaborative approach, and using data to inform all decisions.
Thanks, Michael.
Oh,
Thank you very much.
Hey there, Michael. Thanks for coming on. I've got your next question.
all right.
You state that ensuring financial resources are used according to a plan that prioritizes student achievement and teacher support as another priority, and that you'd like to see stakeholders more involved in the process. Do you think this is happening now? And if not, what specifically would you ask for as a board member, and what do you think it will change?
So sometimes you know too much about a subject and it's hard to answer it in 2 minutes, but let me get right
Give
to
me a
it.
couple extra seconds.
No, okay, so first of all, everybody in this district should Google 90-90-90. And what you'll discover is there are districts all over this country where 90% of the kids are black and brown, 90% of them are above grade level, and 90% of them are on free and reduced lunch. As a result of a look at those districts, you look at, it's distilled into 8 different practices that they use, that they have in common. We need to ensure that we are looking at our district and our instructional practices through that lens. What have they done and how does it compare to what we've done? And to make sure there's an alignment. And then you spend money according to the priority that emerges from those 8 different practices. To make it as simple as I can, it would be as if you got a car that needs a new engine, a new transmission, new tires, it needs to be painted. Well, we know the priority. You're gonna do engine and transmission, then you're gonna get tires, and if there's something left, then you paint it. But in education, what we've done is just go after shiny thing after shiny thing, primarily driven by Hollywood that tells us if there's just a charismatic person in charge or there's a great teacher over here, and we don't look at it as a system and really strengthen the system and then fit people into that system.
Could you also add on to, you were saying you want more stakeholders involved in the process? And then if we do get more stakeholders involved, what would that change?
The stakeholders have to be brought through the same process that the teachers are brought through. So here's an example. The second most important thing in a school day is time. And when you look at what other districts that are successful with similar populations do, there is no McDonald's. There are no birthday parties. You can't hardly go into a school in West Contra, especially the schools in the lower lands, where somebody isn't being brought McDonald's every day. And you say, well, it's not a big deal. It's, they just bring, but every interruption takes away a quarter of an hour before the kids get refocused and re-examined. So you have to have a policy where there is no interruption of core instructional time. And so, but parents you don't need to just put up a sign, you can never have another cupcake brought into the school. They need to be involved in the process, see the research for themselves and go, oh, okay, I can give the cupcakes out at lunchtime or after school. So involving the stakeholders mean we now all are operating through the same lens and focus on the same things, and we know why we're doing what and for what reasons. Hello.
My question is, how do you intend to you have decades of experience as an educator outside of the district and have raised kids in our district.
Yes.
How do you intend to leverage that experience and build strong relationships with West Contra Costa Unified School District educators? Specifically, what will you do to ensure you learn more about the day-to-day experience of educators in our district, and how would this inform your work of overseeing a district with nearly 30,000 students?
Mm-hmm. So while I've been involved in working with districts all over the state in a systemic way, this district has hired me as a consultant and I've been working for the district since 2014, and as a consultant. And so they've given me tasks to do that are related to instruction, such as how can we improve academic language development, or how can we use this new adoption? I was a part of the team that selected the current ELA adoption. So projects off to the side. The other work that I've done with this district is support new teachers. And when you look at the fact that you're losing 300 teachers a year, and that at one particular school, they already know when they're gonna lose all their teachers every other year, I think that experience helps me to understand what the day-to-day operations are like. And so from a board's perspective, it would be around how are we supporting new teachers? What are we doing to support the ongoing education of the veteran teachers? And what are we doing to build cohesion and so that we can establish equity?
So effective board leadership requires listening to the community, reaching out for counsel on important issues, and taking bold actions and positions in the face of opposition. Can you share some examples of those leadership skills in your own life and work?
Early in my career as an educational consultant, I was referred to as an educational entity by the state of California. And my job was to go into districts and to schools and develop and put in place reform practices. These were the rules. The school or district had to improve within a 2-year period. They had to be turned around. If it were not turned around, I could never do the work again. So if you ever failed for any reason, you could never do the work again. You're going into so for about 10 years, I went into very hostile environments where people literally did not even, in fact, in Hayward, they took a vote. How many people never want to see this face again? And they took the vote in public. And I was particularly upset when the people I was working the closest with didn't object. But so I've had about 10 years of experience working in very hostile situations and having the burden of you can't fail. And so what I've learned in that is to bring into any setting the children that I'm there for. And I just go by what I learned from a 5th grader in Oakland at an oratory contest when she said, well, you know why you need to get to the top of the hill? The mountain is just dirt under your feet. So I'm not particularly shaken by people's opinions or faces. Or I know what I know, and I know why I need to do it. And so I'm determined in that way, whether I'm on the board or not. I think that we have to, as a country, as a city, as a district, we've got to do much better than what we've done.
Your next question is, in your questionnaire responses, you stated a number of concerns about racial and socioeconomic inequity in student achievement and the need for coherence between that academic program and social-emotional learning. How do you define equity, and what actions would you take as a trustee to advance educational equity and excellence for all West Contra Costa Unified students?
I think the first step is we have to have a viable intervention system in the district. And by intervention system, I mean there has to be in place an accelerated program that teaches reading comprehension, all forms of language skills, so that by 3rd grade, we don't have 80% of the kids proficient as the goal states in the roadmap for 2022, but that it's more like 90. And the significance between that 10% is that what research shows, if you have 80% of something, it's very similar of having 50% of something, because you still have 20% of the class unable to access the curriculum. Once it gets to 90, that's the tipping point. Now you have a classroom flowing and a teacher can differentiate and meet the needs of students. Equity is, in essence, just simply access. It's access to the curriculum. And we have to have a viable intervention system to make sure that we catch kids up and that we address all of their needs, especially those that are social or emotional, that affect the cognitive.
The next question. Over the past 5 years, education funding for California school districts has increased dramatically, especially in districts serving underserved communities. Yet there is widespread talk about a state of likely district bankruptcies. What factors, in your opinion, generate those fears? Do you believe West Contra Costa School District is at risk of bankruptcy? If so, what can we do to avoid it? If not, why not?
The bankruptcy of districts has altogether to do with a couple different factors, not the least of which is the fact that in certain districts, you have charter schools which siphon off kids from particular neighborhoods, and then therefore when those kids go, the monies go with them. And so then the bankruptcy comes into place when the students with the greater need and great need for greater resources are left behind, and they're within a district, say like Oakland, or in the case of Napa, same kind of situation. And so in order to address that, I know as a parent, I always wanted my kid to go to the safest and best school. And so while I believe in choice, I believe also, more importantly, that a viable public education system is our #1 civil defense, #1 public safety, and of course, it's related to economic development and overall community development. So the public school system has to be a place where parents trust sending their kids, and that the results of them sending their kid to that public school, the life outcomes of those children are ones that the parents desire for their kids. So we have to make the public school system viable. It has to be coherent, and it has to produce. Other than that, parents will always vote with their feet when they have a choice, and they will vote out what is probably the most important institution in America, in my opinion, the public education system.
Great, thank you, Michael. So now we're going to move on to the follow-up questions. We'll have 15 minutes for that, so about 5 to 6 questions. Who would like to start? Scott?
I just wanted, you said your children have gone through this school system, the district, which schools do they go to?
Terra Hills, Pinot Middle, Pinot High.
Okay. And as when your kids were here, how active were you in the educational system, not just with your kids, but in terms of the community?
How active was I?
Yes.
When they were younger, I was less active than I wanted to be because I was traveling all over the state. Most of my work was in the Central Valley, some of it in the Sierra foothills, and a lot of it in Southern California. My wife was a stay-at-home mom, and she was much more active than I. But I like to think that the fact that my kids arrived at school every morning prepared to learn contributed to the environment within the school settings. But in terms of my direct involvement, it was really by example and modeling, although I think I was a very good baseball coach on a volunteer level, truly, really was. and that involved more kids, but it was more my wife with the day-to-day involvement when my kids were in school. So.
So this question is about English language learners and the achievement gap, which is a huge issue, as I'm sure you realize in this district. And I'd like to hear your experience, especially your statewide experience, on whether or not immersion schools and native language instruction can help to overcome that achievement gap. And if so, why haven't they been implemented more, especially in this district?
#1, they can help. The most important factor that I've seen, particularly in the Central Valley, is where you insist on rigor and you protect vigorously the instructional time. And so those principles work whether or not the student speaks Spanish or is an English only or some combination of languages. It doesn't matter. It's the putting in place a rigorous curriculum and protecting the instructional time. Why it hasn't been done in this district, I believe, is that we've never looked at the district through the lens of what other districts have done to be successful with similar populations. I told somebody today from the district, when I was told about the new person coming from Houston, I said, Houston has 300 elementary schools in the district, and over 65% of their students are EL. but yet they outperform the EL students in West Contra. Aren't you interested in what they've done? And so I just think we haven't ever we've gone to the doctor and told the doctor what ails us. We've demanded a prescription, and then we've applied that prescription and leave and not ever get to the core issue. And by core issue is simply looking at what others have done with a similar population to get a different result, and then compare it to what you're doing, and then align your resources to do what others have done that have had success.
And just one quick, I got 19 seconds. You're only gonna be one of 5. How can you get things done on a board of 5?
I'm a convincer, and I'm a collaborator, and I listen well, as evident by the fact I've been married to the same woman for. So I'm a collaborator. I'm a collaborator. I don't do anything on my own. I try not to do anything on my own.
Thank you.
You told in the beginning about a systematic change,
Mhm.
that systematic system to provide change.
Mhm.
Can you be more specific about it? What do you have in mind? What is that you want us to bring? Knowing the situation that we have in the district, what new do you have to bring to improve?
So the federal government has developed 3 or 4 tools that work in conjunction with the state of California, which has developed about 3 tools. And you use, in the use of those tools, so the wheel has already been invented. You use those tools and you have a conversation about your district. And that conversation is where you involve all the stakeholders, everybody from the cafeteria worker to the resource officers, the instructional staff, the administrators, and you go through this process of looking at what the successful school districts have done, looking at what you're doing, and seeing where the impediment is or where the bridges are, and you build consensus around those practices through the use of those tools. And so, as an example, you have in many schools a differing definition for what a learning center is. And so if you have a differing definition, that means you have this random system that's incoherent. And so it's the luck of the draw, where parents will say, I want my kids to go to a good school. And then once they get to a good school, they want a good teacher. Well, as long as that is the mantra of parents, you got a problem. You have to have a coherent system. In the state of California, we insist that if you take your car to get it smogged, it meets certain standards. But yet, in California, we can randomly teach according to what we think. Doesn't have to be so. There was a time when reform was mandated. It's no longer mandated. And so school districts just ignore. So it's not something I would do. It's something I'm familiar with that I would be advocating for the use of.
Hi.
Hello.
So I have 2 questions. You only have 2 minutes to answer.
Okay, I'll try.
Sorry.
Can you ask them one at a time? Then I'll be
Yeah.
boom.
One question, my first question is, do you believe that political aspirations could get in the way of an
Yes.
individual?
Yes, I'm not running. You know what? Almost 90% of the people in Congress started off on the school board. I have no political aspirations, none, 0.
Okay,
Because it will get in the way. Because then you start looking for people for your next move up. Right.
I guess I asked that question because it can get in the way of believing in students and the ability of students to learn, but also listening to parents. So
Yes.
that's one. My next question was, do you believe that you have all the answers, or do you have the ability to do you also see as parents as the experts when it comes to their children?
My mantra and my success in working with districts and schools has been, I don't have any of the answers except one. I know if we agree on something, we can get it done. If we don't agree, it won't get done. So what my whole spiel is that when we work together and we work with the same information and have the same goals in mind, then we should be able to reach agreement. And until we reach agreement, there's no point in going on. Like I said, I've coached new teachers for the last 3 years in this district, and I tell them, you stand at that door, and until the child can walk through the door in a manner that says, I'm ready to learn, it's no point in you having all your plan. In other words, we have to have agreement walking through the door. Same thing with adults. We have to have agreement on what we want for our kids. And until we get to that's the work, is the agreement. But agreement comes when we share information. I listen to you, you listen to me, and we consider because everybody wants the same thing. Nobody sends their kid to school to fail. Nobody comes to school to teach and not want their kids to learn. Everybody wants the same thing. What's the problem? Lack of agreement. So I have no answers other than we must go through a process to get to agreement.
Thank you. Ivy.
Hi.
Hi.
So we have roughly, I think it's 35,000 students enrolled
Mm-hmm.
in our district, and only 5,000 of those kids are Black kids.
Mm-hmm.
And 98% of those kids are performing below grade level.
Mm-hmm.
What do you feel is a crucial component that we need to implement immediately in order to close that achievement gap?
We have something called academic language development, which really grew out of the work Oakland was doing before the turn of the century. It got a bad name in Oakland because you might remember the headlines when they said they're teaching the kids Ebonics.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So there was a misunderstanding on everybody's part of what this woman was actually trying to implement in Oakland. She had gotten her PhD from USC on the very thing that she was trying to implement in Oakland, but she said it wrong, people heard it wrong, the news media gets a hold of it, then it becomes terrible. But all over the country now, and in this district, people adopted its basic principles, academic language development. What we have to do though, particularly with African American kids, we have to combine it with social and emotional development. Every school in this district has a social emotional program that sits on the wall and says, be kind, do this, do that, but nobody ever looks, it's wallpaper. It has to be combined with the ALD program, and you will change the outcomes for African American children whose particular issue around achievement in school has altogether to do with something called the word gap, which this district has been at the forefront of at least exposing, but not integrating into the classroom. And the word gap simply comes from the result of having been slaves. And so when people told you not to talk, you didn't talk. Anything you say can and will be used against you. And so that is part of the African American experience in families. Talking about each other, playing the dozens, putting you down, and then you get to school and you're supposed to achieve. But if you combine the social, emotional with the academic language development, I think you'll see the same kind of explosion with African American kids as you see in places like Norfolk, Virginia, and Houston, Texas, or Milwaukee.
Just one more. So a lot of, there's a lot of push for parent engagement.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see, or how do you define parent engagement?
I think parent engagement is teaching parents how they can best support their kids. How they can best support their kids. And I could think of two very practical ways off the top of my head where I've seen a big change happen. One is when you teach parents how to talk to their own kids in a positive way. The second is to talk to parents about the importance of every single minute. And when you could use a monetary example, or you could just use an emotional example. But the reality is, when parents understand that, there's a lot of money, as you mentioned, there's billions coming into these districts, and it's only coming in because your kid is bringing it. And if you talk to your kid differently, you'll get a different result. When parents are informed of what their role is, then they become engaged before the school day starts. And the whole idea behind uniforms was always misunderstood. Nobody wanted all the kids to wear the same thing, so they're wearing the same thing. What you're doing is trying to get parents to understand they have a role before school starts. But so that concept can be illustrated as they did in Long Beach Unified for years. It could be used in such a way to engage parents, but if you don't tell parents why, then it just becomes, you have rules without relationship, and you're going to create rebellion, especially from people who have been disenfranchised and not involved in the system or its change. So I say involve parents in every aspect of how the school operates, how the district operates, but inform them.
Ms. Michael, can I have one last question?
If you were elected, what do you think would be the most challenging thing or the biggest learning curve for you?
The biggest learning curve, I think, would have to do with the management of a $350 million budget, and to put it in context. I mean, this district is one of the larger ones in the state of California. I worked with Diablo Unified, and it's a similar size, but I think the diversity here is greater. You know, I don't think they have a Kensington in Diablo Valley Unified, and nor do they have a North Richmond. But they have some similar characteristics, but they don't have the extreme that's in this district. Mm-hmm. And so when you have precious resources and you're managing them, you do have to consider the needs of everybody. And in doing so, I think that the biggest learning curve I would have would be, how do you prioritize and utilize those resources in a way that makes everybody feel like they're getting a fair share out of the district's resources.
Mr. Gonzales, are you familiar with the LCAP?
Yes.
Good. What do you think about the district spending $2.4 million in 13 SRO for schools, especially in middle school and high school, that mostly of them are in low-income communities, Richmond and San Paulo?
What I think about spending $2.4 million on the officers that are in the low-income schools? Yeah. The officers, see, I've seen the extreme. I've literally seen an officer change a family for the better in a very difficult situation. But I've also seen officers who, you know, I'm a parent. I'm at the orientation with the SRO, and he's telling me in so many words that if your kid gets out of line, I'm gonna take them down. Really? Is that what you want to tell me? You know? And so to me, it's not the money that's spent. It's the individuals that are, it's their orientation. They're contributing to the criminalization of adolescent behavior, whether they know it or not. We need a different training and a different kind of officer at those schools, and then the money might be worth it. Like I said, I was in a situation where police were called, and a mother, she had hit her child at school. She was frustrated, single mom, black, son black, not listening to any of the teachers. I think he might even threaten the teacher, and she just came up there and just knocked him down. And then they called the police, they called Child Protective, blah, 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 blah. And the police officer, though, he skillfully addressed it in such a way it changed that boy's life and it changed the mom's life. He could have easily just arrested the mom or did this or did that, but he got in there and was involved, as opposed to just, as some of, I mean, even in some of the schools, the parents are intimidated by the officers.
Okay, can I make another question after that?
And that's the last question.
Okay.
I like your questions.
Okay, so based on your opinion, do you really think that kids need officers, knowing that you have made a good recapitulation about the emotional problems in the community, in the families, and around all the environment we have in our cities. Do you think it's necessary to have officers in the schools?
To have the right ones. That's all I'm
Do you
saying.
qualify the right ones?
I don't know that we have enough time. The ones that are A, from the community, B, relate to the community, they have some sensitivity to the issues in the community, and have somewhat of a social service background, but a law enforcement authority as well. And the reason why I say yes is that what a missed opportunity if we don't bridge the gap between law enforcement and communities where there's a great need for law enforcement. If we don't bridge that gap, and here's an opportunity to do that if we have people who are especially skilled at bridging that gap. But if we just say no officers, then it becomes us and them. So
So the students need an officer or a counselor?
I got a call one time when I was in Safeway, and the call was from a teacher, and she said, a big black man just came in my classroom and kidnapped your son. Now, at that point, we need an officer. You follow? I mean, that's a real case. That really happened. And I thank God, but it's interesting, who actually saved my son was a librarian on her way to work at Berkeley. But I thank God for the fact that they rallied and they came, and I was comforted that no, it wasn't a group of counselors, it was a group of officers and that had guns and walkie-talkies, and they were looking for my son, but it was the librarian on her way to work that rescued him on Appian Way. So there are some things that happen, but at the same time, I think we need community-minded officers, I think.
When you call the police, do that?
Huh?
If you call the police, if the school, some big man came into the school,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
you would call the police, your local police to come in on that situation. You wouldn't have to be taking money from the school budget.
Right, that's true, but I mean, I think the idea is to build relationship. And if you build relationships, that can only happen through time and proximity. Somebody just responding to something is not going to, in my opinion, have the same impact as somebody who's kind of just a presence and is also community minded. I probably got more yellow signs. Both of them waving yellow.
It's like, we're done, we're done.
Oh, I thought this was a party gift.